came up in our conversation before this, that it was really difficult emotionally, obviously, to do this, and I think I basically ran out of steam. But what happened subsequently over the last 2 years is that it has given me some opportunity to reflect on our own practice. I was a legal academic, working with students at Jindal University, where I used to teach in Sonipat. We did some legal clinics around hate crime. And also I'll tell you a bit more about how I got sort of associated with this issue. And I think this moment is really exciting for me because it's given me some time to reflect on that again, in some sort of like a structured way. But my comments may not be completely structured. I'm hoping to leave open as many questions or avenues as possible so that then we can have a conversation. So hopefully there won't be much closure. I'll try my best not to provide much closure towards the end. Now what I'll try and do here, also I think partly in partly also in response to or thinking more about the kind of work that colleagues here at ALF do, and many of the other people in the room and outside do, which is to collect, to document violence. Right? And I'm using violence because what we call that violence is quite important, and that is sort of one of the key aims of this conversation, which is how do we conceptualize it? I said how hate crime is conceptualized, but perhaps I could have framed it as how is violence conceptualized? And what work does that do? And what work does framing it, naming it as hate crime do? And try and think a bit from one prism about how we talk about violence and how we document it, and also how law comes into the picture. So these are sort of broad sort of aims. And in that process, maybe throw up some concerns about the potentials and limitations of this particular way of talking about violence, which is hate crime. So, as I said, my own association with this, broadly speaking, work on violence emerged when I came back after my doctoral studies, and I started working with some human rights organizations in Delhi. So I started working with Harsh Mandar's organization, Center for Equity Studies, which practically doesn't exist today for very predictable reasons. And we started slowly working on instances of mob lynching. This is a phrase which Manu also mentioned, and maybe we'll get problematized a bit more. And I think the big moment in North India, at least, was the 2015 lynching, quote unquote, of Pehlu Khan, and around that several other cases. And eventually, what the Supreme Court called India mobocracy, and that became another word, and then that kept, how discourses sort of build up around these things. Now, I'm not saying that's not true. I don't know what mobocracy means, but it is true that there were a series of what we now perhaps would call hate crime incidents, but there was also perhaps a realization or a feeling that there is a spike in it, right? But that was a dividing point at that time. It's sort of quite difficult to visualize it. This is 2015, 2016, when the conversation around religion-based crimes or hate crimes was just emerging. And the conversation was about even making the case that something like this is going on. And it was very difficult to do. And it was around that time that some of us, along with Harsh, started this thing called Karwan-e-Mohabbat. In the background, there would be sort of blurred sort of image of that. Which itself, by the way, just notice the language here, Karwan-e-Mohabbat, which literally means the caravan of love. And there was this sort of implicit conceptualization of a contrast between love and hatred. That what is really going on is intolerance, another word, I don't know whether we talk about it very much now, framing it like that, and the word hate somehow started to come into the picture. And what has happened since then is that the language of hate, and what I mean by language of hate is thinking about violence in terms of the word hate, has proliferated. So in 2015 or 2016, people perhaps would call it intolerance, would even call it lynching, etc. But as you'll see, several initiatives or in public discourse, even in advocacy work, even in the reports that you have worked on, this is described as a problem of hate crime. And hate seems to be a problem. And it's something to think about. Is hate the problem? What is hate? Is hate a bit too sort of loose a category to really capture what is going on? And also, why didn't we use other categories? We have atrocities, for instance. Why didn't we use the word atrocities, even though it was associated a lot with caste, but not conceptually, not necessarily. And maybe I'll come back to it towards the end. So how did I come into the picture? There was a desire at that time that, along with these sort of initiatives of, let me say, some sort of social intervention and support for victims of these kind of crimes, we should start doing some documentation and data work. And it was in that context, in around 2015 or 2016, I would say, that the language of hate crime started emerging. So, for instance, Hindustan Times started this initiative called Hate Tracker. Right? The word hate sort of emerged. I started working with friends here in Bangalore, India Spend, and we started a database called Hate Crime Tracker, like Camp Watch, I think it was called. It was in India Spend shut it down, and then it sort of moved out. All these things shut down very quickly. But the language which was sort of adopted here was, or many of us decided to adopt, was the language of hate crime. And we at that time had long discussions about what is the language we should use, right? So there were other languages which were in operation. So for example, in the legal discourse, or even data documentation, NCRP discourse, the most familiar word perhaps is riot, or communal riot. But it was quite early on we realized that is just not a good word to work with. Because the word riot completely depoliticizes the nature of the problem. Even if it's and riot obviously focuses on the mode of violence, the scale of violence, frames it as a law and order issue. And obviously, these kind of so-called individualized incidents of targeting, or another word we working was targeted killing, riot just doesn't do justice to it. A communal incident was another word which our legal or data documentation techniques use. And then there were others. So for instance, India Spend at that time had already started building a database on cow vigilantism, cow killing, cow-related violence. That was obviously quite narrow because it's cow, but vigilantism for me represented another issue, which was vigilantism in a way quite implicitly foregrounds the alleged guilt of the person who is being killed. Because when you say there's a vigilante group and that is responding to a certain social deviant behavior, even if we as sort of community say that's a bad thing to do, we always assume that the victim has done something before. So vigilantism sounded unconvincing for us. Another word was mob lynching, right? What is lynching? And lynching, I think, does something very similar, because lynching seems to presuppose a certain deviant behavior by the victim, which then gets the crowd, pulls in the crowd, and then a violence happens. Also, mob lynching has, the language itself is framed in law and order terms. There's a mob, there's a problem of legal order, there's a size, there's a mode of violence, and we realize it's sort of quite difficult to rely on those categories. So what some of us started doing was to frame it, and it's autobiographical, right? I'm sure different people were doing different things, but for us, the attraction at India Spend, for instance, and in relation to Garwani Mohabbat, was to start framing this around the language of hate crime. And there were several reasons for it. So one, there is a more globally understood, and when I say globally, it's Western, so perhaps I should say Western, in Europe and in the United States, this definition of hate crime, which means something definitionally very specific. It means when perpetrators are motivated, so there's an element of motivation, by hostility, also other people say hatred, but hostility is a better word perhaps, towards the real or perceived identity of it. And the definition doesn't solve our problems, because each of these terms, as the lawyers in the room or those journalist friends who work with legal materials, know these things are open to sort of multiple interpretations, but at least we know what to hold on to. So one was that at least we had some definition. Because what was the trouble at that time? The trouble was to document and establish that this is a problem, right? And that the problem perhaps has grown over a period of time. There's a problem of scale. The second attraction about the hate crime definition was the individualization. So this is not a riot, this is not a clash, this is about an individual victim. And the third we hoped was that this would present a victim-centric picture in the language we use. So hate crime may happen, a person can be a victim of hate crime, compare that with vigilantism or lynching, which somehow immediately brings to mind some context of violence, which if the victim is not completely blameworthy, but at least is implicit in, right? And that was another attraction. And the larger literature on hate crime, which I'll sort of come to, I think also allowed us to go back to the politics of hate crime. Because the larger conversation in the West, particularly around hate crime, is that minorities tend to be victims of hate crime disproportionately. There's this baggage of academic learning, right, that we could hold on. But I think fundamentally it was a strategic decision. it was that who are we talking to? If we would want to adopt a language which can speak to an international audience. Because at one level, at that time, we wanted to speak to the world and say that this is a serious problem. This new regime is a problem, and this is a problem that is only growing and is fundamentally connected to their politics. And therefore, the international legibility of the hate crime language of framing was of great significance. Now, I don't know how much of this kind of thinking has gone into, all these other, the left side, all these United Against Hate and India Against Hate, Citizens Against Hate, all these colleagues and friends and all of us were sort of working broadly together in different capacities. But I don't know how much of this thinking, or even sort of Hindustan Times tracker, thought about this category in those ways. But subsequently, I think the more I reflected on it, I realized this seems to be the attraction of using the category of hate crime. And a lot of so-called anti-hate advocacy started emerging around this time. Now, one way to sort of describe this, and I'm going to use Mohsin Chatterjee's recent work on Gujarat and his legal ethnography. We can dig sort of deeper into it, but there's a really interesting contrast he makes between two different kinds of politics. One is what he calls the politics of exposure, which I'll focus on now, then I'll come to the second one later. And what he says is that a lot of our, I think it may apply to many other people, but a lot of advocacy work which we do relies on a performance politics of exposure, which is to expose violent behavior by state and non-state. So, for instance, the reports we work on, right? I was there at a panel at NLS right now. There's a conference going on, and I was on a panel on exceptionalism and exceptional violence. And we had two colleagues who I knew from there presenting a paper on extrajudicial killings, or what are called encounters. Again, notice the language, right? Encounter could be a romantic encounter, a sudden moment, or whatever. Extrajudicial killing brings a whole range of, and also strikes international conversations. Extrajudicial killing sounds like what we see with African Americans in the US, or we see in indigenous communities in Australia, or we see in like conflict-ridden areas. So that intellectual baggage, the images of language is significant. But anyway, their report was on extrajudicial killings by UP police. And that is that. They reported, they documented, they gave evidence and said, this is what is going on. Exposing state or non-state violence. And that is sort of the politics of exposure which Mohsin is critiquing. But he's critiquing through a different angle. Which is that what he says is that there's a problem with this sort of politics of exposure. It's not that it's not needed, we do it, we have to do it, we have to expose the state. But exposure is just not enough. Because that also assumes that suddenly we'll be surprised that there are extrajudicial killings in UP. So when they were telling me that hundreds of people are being shot, I'm like, it's terrible. Yeah, and maybe we should do something about it. But there's nothing there in that repertoire which really tells us anything more. Or at least that's what Chatterjee is saying, and I think we need to engage with it because we're in this space. And the alternative he proposes is a politics of composition, composing violence. And what he means by that is that the problem with exposing violence is just in the nature of how it's written. It seems to present a picture as if violence is episodic, extraordinary, exceptional, that life is okay in UP and then these terrible extrajudicial killings happen. It also doesn't tell us in what context is this violence emerging, the everyday, socially embedded nature of violence. That there are certain kinds of people who get killed. What is the nature of policing in its everyday form, even when it does not lead to an extrajudicial killing? And perhaps more importantly, what work is this violence doing? Why do people engage in violence? Because between two instances of lynchings, it's not that violence stops. Before violence happens, it's not that there's no violence. What creates or constitutes that moment of violence? What work is it doing? A really good, I'm just sort of footnote, a really good book telling us that is Revati Law's book on anatomy of hate. So it's quite a simple book in its sort of structure, but what she talks about is in Gujarat riots in 2002, and she just spends time, she was a journalist at that time, with 4 perpetrators of violence, just looking at what did violence mean to them, why did they engage in violence, and she has a provocative way of sort of framing it in completely non-academic terms, which is that violence is actually the moment when politics stops. Politics actually builds up under violence, that's what we need to study, and then it drops again, and then it starts again. So the interesting thing to compose violence is to actually see what happened before and after violence. In Moyuk's case, he would say that how ordinary legal practices of writing, recording, actually create subordination, because that is the basis of violence. The word he uses is minoritization, but it could be any form of subordination in my view. And the more I sort of look back at that work, I think hate crime does provide a conceptual and theoretical space to do that. And the reason for that is because in hate crime scholarship, and the sociologists and others, anthropologists who study hate crime, for them hate crime is not just sort of the moment of individual violence directed at a certain victim, but it is something that expresses deeply embedded hierarchies in society. It's an expression of domination. So the work that violence is doing is both expressing and performing that kind of domination, but also entrenching it, also legitimizing it. And therefore, the conversation around hate crime then opens up dramatically. We are not only looking at documentation, right? That's the kind of work we were doing, that this happened and that happened, but really looking at sort of longue durée of these forms of domination. And we see that in caste, right? Those people who study caste know that atrocities, no matter how much we try, we focus too much on that dramatic moment of atrocities act, the action of atrocity, misses the actual context in which, the socio-economic political context in which caste hierarchies exist, which allow these incidents to happen, that these incidents of violence then do a certain work in that social context. I'll perhaps have a bit of time to say something about Atrocities Act in a bit, and I think Atrocities Act does a decent job of at least recognizing or seeing that. Very quickly, I don't have a lot of time to sort of go into it, but just another sort of autobiographical, more than happy to sort of elaborate on that more. A way of now in hindsight combining both the exposure and the composition of violence is what we tried to do at the Jindal Legal Clinic on hate crime. And I think combining them together has the capacity to enrich legal critique. So very quickly in 2018, the Supreme Court gave this order of mobocracy order. Deepak Mishra basically gave a series of guidelines, right? Notice the exposure mode in which this is sort of operating, right? Now, extrajudicial killing, let's have NHRC guidelines, have some guidelines, have the police do it, and then we'll keep sending people to monitor whether these guidelines are followed or not. That's a mode of exposure. And they gave these orders, standard things like if somebody is, and the language they used was lynching, mob lynching. So anybody who sort of does lynching, then the police must file 153A, which is enmity among groups, another language which we decided. So 153A says that it criminalizes words, actions that create or have the capacity to create animosity or enmity among groups. Law and order framing as groups, right? And the state coming as a neutral observer trying to balance these marauding groups killing each other and trying to bring some order in the scales. That's sort of the implicit understanding in 153. But again, Supreme Court said, file 153 immediately, please file FIR standard, sort of nothing unusual, something which should have perhaps happened in any case. And what we tried to do in the legal clinic was in Haryana and UP, the best states for this kind of research if you're ever interested. But so is Karnataka, by the way. Dakshin Karnataka is a gold mine, for better or for worse, I suppose, for doing this work. But why this is needed, and Karnataka is another reason why I'm so glad to be speaking at here. And we tried to sort of just follow what happens when a case of lynching happens. My initial intuition was Supreme Court laid down these guidelines but never defined what lynching was. So I thought that's what we'll find, and which we did. I'm happy to go into some cases in detail, but I'll just highlight sort of the findings, I suppose. I think the first major finding was that there was no institutional understanding of lynching, which in hindsight was not surprising, also not the most exciting finding. But I think what I found most interesting in what was happening, and we went to Bareilly, I actually developed the case in that article written there, the crime vanishes, is when there is a complaint about lynching, whatever the social meaning of the word lynching is, what does the police do then? And at that time, around Western UP, there was paranoia around cattle stealing. And there were lots of lynchings happening for cattle stealing. But sort of the criminalization of minority communities, particularly Muslims in UP, overlaps completely with this paranoia around lynching, of cattle chore or cattle chori. Because those communities are understood to be basically thieves. The same thing happens in Haryana around Noon, which was another sort of very important Mewat, where Mewati Muslims are just seen as these criminals who go and steal and then eat cows. And that's sort of the stereotype. And what we found following some of these cases is that the police, the first thing the police does is, if there is a complaint that there could be lynching by family, they immediately frame it as, even if they're sort of thinking in terms of lynching, they frame it as cattle. And the way the FIR is written, the story in the FIR is that these people, unknown people, went in, they tried to steal the cattle, and then in response, the community came in and they beat them up or stiffened them a bit, and then called the police and sent them off. This person, Shahrukh, whose story I tell in this article, something similar happened. It's quite also unlikely, and I hate to say this, but it's quite unlikely he went in to steal cattle, but that's irrelevant, right? Because the story that is visible in FIR is his guilt, right? And that's sort of foregrounded. And ultimately, the FIR tells a story, not even sort of mentions the word lynching. It becomes a story about cattle stealing and about the community trying to safeguard its property and then sending this person back to the police. And sort of the larger point over there was really about how official discretion is used to build a certain story in the FIR, in the charge sheet, and using provisions in order to hide what has already happened, or at least should have been investigated into further. And our broader conclusion there was that Tehseen Poonawalla guidelines are just not going to work because these everyday practices of official discretion are built around in these socially embedded contexts of subordination. And that is how these stories will be told. So unless we handle those larger questions, we don't have an answer how we do it, at least in the paper. But those people working on caste or gender, etc., know that this is exactly how the police would frame these stories. Now, just a few things afterwards, again in the autobiographical mode. The struggle for me subsequently was to really test what kind of work can the hate crime language do in both its exposing and composing capacities. And we tried to sort of experiment with the concept. So for instance, 2 years ago, we had an online training session. It was framed as a training session because those are the people who gave us money for it and they wanted to train. But what we tried to do was hang out with some researchers, lawyers, journalists, those were usually the usual suspects, and introduce them to the hate crime language and try to see what would they do with it. And it was fascinating, and we tried to sort of document that in one of the pieces we had written. But the most fascinating thing for us was that they, within 2 weeks, they drifted towards composing violence, quite automatically. For them, the language of hate crime was not just about prosecuting. It was about reparation, right? It was about the fact of recognizing that the victims and victim communities are central and subordination is central. They felt that the hate crime language can actually point us towards those reparative activities, even if the state is against us. Then once we document hate crime, we know which communities need our help, and we can go and help them for rehabilitation, or for documentation, for storytelling, and also then to keep track on those communities and see how violence gets embedded in day-to-day practices. Now very quickly, because I think this is the last slide and then I would like to just stop. I didn't get to say very much about critiquing the hate crime language as well, in the concept itself, but maybe I'll just say one thing, which is how hate crime policy, legal policy has developed in the West. And there are some serious criticisms against that hate crime language, or hate crime laws, because in Europe, in the UK and US, and sort of the big Australia and Canada, etc. Anyway, that sort of particular spectrum of Western countries do have these hate crime laws in place. And some of the most important criticisms against them have been, number one, that they tend to flatten identities. And so one concern has been that because hate crime laws tend to rely on specifying the ground of violence. So going back to sort of the definition of hate crime, that perpetrators must be motivated towards the hostility of real or perceived identity. So which identity? Okay? So can it be race? So race is quite ubiquitous. Can it be gender? Deeply debated issue, including the UK, where the trans identity can be a basis of hate crime. But for instance, can it be homeless people? Is homelessness an identity? And one major critique, constructive critique, participating critique, against the hate crime policy has been that just because some groups are able to put that political pressure to be included in the definition of hate crime as grounds, doesn't mean other groups don't also exhibit similar or worse kinds of vulnerability. And perhaps hate crime should move away from the language of identity to language of vulnerability. I feel that in many ways, the Atrocities Act does that. Even though it focuses on caste, but caste is a profoundly complicated, difficult social notion, but also a notion that can be legally regulated. Maybe we'll talk about that a bit more in the discussion. But I think the Atrocities Act does a great job in appreciating intersectional vulnerability, for instance. If you just look at that long list of different kinds of acts that can be counted as atrocities. Before the Atrocities Act, under the Untouchability Prevention Act and others, the language was used was quite similar to hate crime language, which is crime committed on the ground of untouchability. And anybody who studied that act would know that it was an absolute nightmare. Not only because to determine what the motivation is on the ground, what does on the ground mean, what is untouchability? And Constitution doesn't define untouchability. It's an extremely complicated, socially embedded context, which forces you to then look at how the larger social context exhibits forms of subordination. And Atrocities Act moved away from that. And I think in a major part that can be appreciated as the act understanding of vulnerabilities themselves. Another sort of attractive thing about the Atrocities Act, which I think the Western context does not exhibit, is tailoring of definitions. Again, Atrocities Act does that really well. It focuses on knowledge rather than motivation. So major part of the Atrocities Act is if a crime is being committed against a member of the scheduled caste category where the perpetrator had the knowledge that that person is from the scheduled caste category. Knowledge is much easier to legally establish. Not that we have been able to do it in this legal system, but that's another reason. But conceptually it's easier to establish as opposed to the intention or motivation of attacking a particular identity. And again, Atrocities Act gives a long list of illustrations and a long list of acts, words, contexts that we would be able to identify a certain atrocity. That doesn't exist in Western context at all. And I think that is an emerging critique of the hate crime legal policy. And then again, maybe I'll just end with this, which is the language of hate itself. Maybe let's sort of spend a bit of time thinking about, is the language of hate really the ideal way to do caste crimes happen because their victims are hated? Is that really at stake? Was the language of hate sort of is in contrast with the language of love? So is that what we are really looking for? Is that the ideal? I don't have any answers for it. I'm not providing any clues. I'm curious about it. But in any case, in those jurisdictions where hate crime laws do exist, the language of hate does get critiqued. But also because, and it gets critiqued also. Well, there are all sorts of people who critique it. One set of people critique that we have the right to hate. We hate all sorts of things. We hate all sorts of ideas. The other thing is that the more constructive critique perhaps is that the language of hate is too heightened. Most hate crimes in those jurisdictions that record it officially actually happen in absolutely mundane, ordinary, everyday capacities. People are not hating the other person, but it's the reason why those crimes tend to happen is because the people who do it feel they can get away with it. It's absolutely okay to do it. It's normal to do it. People don't hate homeless people in any sort of emotive, that affect doesn't exist necessarily, but because it's absolutely acceptable to do it, right? So, what the language of hate is doing there has been subject of critique, and I think in our Indian context, it's worth considering whether that language actually helps us, what kind of conversations are being foreclosed or open up, or whether there are better categories or better languages. I told you there were strategic reasons for us accepting it. We didn't reinvent anything, but it's something that I'm constantly struggling with. So I'm going to stop here and hopefully we'll have a little more conversation about these things.
Thanks, Mohsin. So, while his talk and his initial comment has given us a lot to think about, in having a lot of us have done this work on the ground in terms of fact findings, documenting this kind of hate crimes, and ourselves engaging with the concept in some way or the other. So we wanted to just provide a response of some sort which could possibly also help spark a discussion over here for the rest of you all. And the response is basically structured in two parts. The first part is in terms of thinking about what does the concept of hate crime do in our understanding about the state. What is the kind of responsibility we're giving to the state, and what is the state actually able to do? And the second part of it is, of course, the transformational capacity that possibly the concept of hate crimes has, right? What does it necessarily change about the way we are understanding hate crimes? What does it change about the outcome for the victim community when it comes to hate crimes? So just thinking a little bit about the first part, which is the question of state, right? So when you were talking about the kind of bias that the police has and the prosecutorial bias and the kind of documentation that they have in FIRs and so on, I also wanted to highlight that how this kind of bias is experienced across communities, right? And I just wanted to read out one part of a testimony from a pastor from the Christian community. In 2021, there were 39 documented instances of hate crimes against Christians in Karnataka. And we basically spoke to them and tried to understand what exactly was transpiring and what was the kind of language, which a lot of which is what Mohsin emphasized on, what was the language being used by the perpetrators and by the state. And I just want to read out some part because I found that very remarkable in terms of what it was saying to us. So this is basically an instance in Udupi in 21, and he was conducting a prayer meeting, and how these attacks happened in a template fashion was there was a prayer meeting, and there was then an attack by a mob, quote unquote, or a group of people to dislodge this prayer meeting, and violence was used. Different forms of violence was used to do that. And so this pastor essentially says that I went to the police station to lodge a complaint against the miscreants, and to my shock, there was already an FIR lodged against me under 295A by someone named Sunil, who I remember meeting 2 years ago. I continued to insist that they file a complaint against the violent extremist. I informed that even a woman was attacked during this violence, whose blouse was torn. She also wanted to file a complaint, but the police said all the information can be in the same complaint. They said that they have registered my complaint, but refused to give me any acknowledgement or document confirming the same. They asked the woman to bring the torn part of the blouse, and when she did, the police official said, how do we know that you have not cut this off yourself with scissors? For 2 weeks after that, the prayers completely stopped. The police told us there will be a quote-unquote law and order issue, so it's better if you don't do any prayer meetings at all. We cannot protect you if you still decide to go ahead and do it. So this statement from the pastor is revealing in terms of not just the fact that the police itself takes a role of a biased role. The argument that I'm really trying to make here, that the police is in some sense complicit with these kind of hate crimes and with the perpetrators of these hate crimes. And in a system where this complicity is inbuilt in the law itself, where you have the section 295A, or in other cases you have the anti-conversion law, or you have the cattle slaughter prohibition. In all of these ways, when the law is inbuilt and the system and the state is going to behave in a way that's complicit, what is it that the hate crime concept can possibly offer us that the laws so far are not, right? And it's also the question of what is so unique about the emotion of hate that makes a hate crime much worse than a murder, right? When you're murdering somebody, when you're raping somebody, when these acts of gruesome violence are done, these acts of gruesome violence also come out of some place. And so what is it that this question of hate is doing so differently that the state needs to think of it differently? And that's the first comment. The second part of it is, of course, in terms of accountability, right? Now, if you identified this as a hate crime, as a concept, and you're now going to say, even if we imagine the police and the state in which we're going to have a functional, independent police where you don't have them basically being the servants of the political masters and the political ideology, even in that scenario, what is it that the hate crime concept is imagining in terms of transformation, in terms of retribution, in terms of the question of justice altogether, right? Are we imagining higher punishments? Are we imagining reparation? Are we imagining victim compensation to a much higher level? What is it that we're imagining that the concept will do for us in especially the Indian context. The third comment, I think, and I'd really like to hear a lot more from Mohsin on this, is that the question of documentation, right? So even if we imagine that the state is not going to go ahead and provide an accurate documentation of how this violence happens, say for instance, um, just this is a very common occurrence where they don't necessarily, in the FIRs, the documentation like he was mentioning, they wouldn't include the concept of hate, or they wouldn't include the slurs that were used and so on, right? So what is it that in terms of documentation that civil society can do, like similar to the hate crimes tracker that you were referring to? And what is it that we can imagine the state to also do? Because in his paper, I'd urge everybody to read his paper also, because he refers to the UK policy, where even non-hate crime but hate incidents are mandated to be documented, and which speaks to what he was saying, that you don't necessarily document just the crime, but you document and understand the before and after of what is allowing for this kind of subordination and this kind of violence to be perpetrated. What is it in this environment that's happening before and that's happening after? And the third comment that I just wanted to speak a little bit about, I know you mentioned this briefly in terms of when you started your presentation, saying that there's a context of the rise after 2014. In all the cases that we have worked on and we've documented, and many others can speak to this also, there is a political ideology that is furthering this kind of hate in India in this context, right? And in the
Name it.
it's the Hindu nationalism that is sort of behind, and the Hindutva that's behind, that is sort of perpetrating the propaganda, the machinery that's in place with the disinformation campaigns, the hate speech, and which is a well-oiled machinery, and it's supported by the state, right? And very overtly supported by the state when you have elected representatives making, like Shobha Karandraje, Anand Kumar Hegde, all of them coming out and making open statements at different points in time, whether it's for the economic boycott of Muslims or whether it is for calls for segregation, calls for genocide. And we have seen this very systematically being built up, right? So in our articulation of the hate crime concept, where do we, in the asymmetry that you mentioned of the victims and the perpetrators, where is it that we can configure the question of political ideology? Because we need to understand that there is a political ideology that is against the question of democracy, that is against dignity, that's against self-expression, that's against choice, that's against autonomy, that's against freedoms and independence, right? And so that understanding of ideology and what ideology is it that is against this, how do we is there even a possibility of feeding that into the law? Because if, like we see 153A, it says promoting enmity between groups. But which groups? Right? And who are the groups that are promoting enmity? And in what circumstances does that happen? And why is it that it's only one community's response is sometimes documented as, say, for example, quote-unquote communal rights, right? Why is it that it's called cattle chori? Why is it always termed like that? And which community is that? It's a Muslim community. So what is the role that we can find of political ideology in embedding in terms of the hate crimes concept? And finally, in terms of what does the hate crimes concept change, right? If one were to start thinking about what is it changing for us, I think the part that it would be great if you could speak a little bit about is that he mentions in his paper that there are different, the reason that there is no critical solidarity with people of marginalized communities, whether it's Dalits, whether it's Muslims, whether it's Christians, is that because the pathways of your any kind of resolution and justice are also different. And if I've understood correctly, what he means is about the existence of the different commissions, right? In the national level, the state level, you have the Human Rights Commission, you have the Backward Classes, Backward Caste Commission, you have the, you have a Women's Commission, you have a range of these commissions that exist. But the question that came up for me is that these commissions also arose out of a political demand, right? They also came out of a history where they experienced the experience of their identity itself, the experience of that marginalization itself was so different from the other, possibly, that this kind of critical solidarity in imagining any kind of justice was just not possible. So in that context, what is the hate crime concept possibly going to offer to change, and how do we reconcile the possible differences that exist between communities, right? Because it's not like all marginalized communities agree on everything altogether. Bring up the question of abortion rights, right? There is no agreement necessarily over there. So I will stop here. I have more comments, but I will want. I mean, it will be great if maybe Mohsin can respond, and we can open up the floor for discussion. I just want to end with sharing one of the instances that we've just recently visited of a hate crime, and I think it's important to talk about it because we don't often realize how close it is to us when it happens and what all in our individual capacities we can do. So this is basically a person who lives in Kanakpura. His name is Anish. And on the 23rd of July, he was standing next to a field and with his two other family members when he's from the SC community. When some folks from the Vokaliga community, some men from the Vokaliga community who are also rowdy sheeters. They basically, this field was right next to the road, and they basically asked them to move away from the road. And this was not, of course, done politely. I'm not going to reiterate the language it was done in. And this escalated to a little bit of a verbal fight, which ended with the use of caste slurs against them. And these are not known to each other. These are not people who knew each other before this. And the next thing that happened, which is quite unimaginable, is that a couple of hours later, these Vokaliga folks show up at the doorstep of Anish. They have shown up with an enlarged machete, basically just what you cut tender coconut with, right? And they have chopped off his hand, and they have injured 3 other members of his family, and this is all because of one verbal assault, one verbal fight that so to say happened on the basis of the caste pride that happened there. And his hand can't be joined back. It's amputated now, and of course the treatment is underway. The situation. I mean, there has been response by the state. There has been a peace meeting that happened. There also was, the state's involvement, the social welfare department's involvement in making sure that money reaches the family for treatment and so on. But it is to say that how do we often think in urban contexts or in close context to cities, these incidents of hate crimes don't happen. And so how do we even grapple with the enormity of this, and what is it that each one of us can individually do in our capacities when it comes to basically violence like this that's happening on our streets, and how do we protect our own brothers and sisters and our own people in the name of the constitution that we all came to abide by, right? So with that, I'll just stop, and maybe we can, I don't know if you want to respond first, you want to open for discussion.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond quickly.
Yeah.
I think they're all fabulous, really important comments and questions. Just wanted to sort of add on to your point about criminalizing the victim, because I realized I didn't sort of emphasize that enough, because the major theme in hate crime cases among the cases we study, but definitely in these cases that are popularly known as lynching cases, invariably they involve criminalizing the victim. At one level, it's not surprising, right? Because victims are always criminalized. But for perhaps one interesting thing is the modality through which it sort of works. So in cow-related matters, for instance, the cattle laws, in Christian cases, it is the anti-conversion law. But I felt in the cases we studied, the language of lynching itself contributes to that criminalization. Because as I said, that it sort of assumes that the first act was done by the victim, right? So why did lynching happen? Lynching happened because of cattle. There must be a cow-related cattle law in Haryana or in UP that has to be enforced first, right? Because the mob was in response to a particular crime that happened. So that sort of criminalizing the victim is inbuilt in some of these legal forms. Now, what can hate crime concept do in responding to that? I think, well, the first thing it would be, what is the hate crime concept? What exactly is the work that it can do? And it's good that sort of it's come up again. I think for me at least, the generous reading of the hate crime concept is that it comes with a repertoire or a bucket of different kinds of understandings and institutional forms. So a hate crime concept or hate crime framing or hate crime understanding is not only that there should be a law that regulates this. That just won't work. Because the reason why we need a hate crime law necessitates telling the police why it's needed. It necessitates telling the police that this is how you understand motivation. Necessitates telling them that motivation emerges out of socially embedded contexts. any good response to hate crime requires the police to understand or accept or appreciate that minorities invariably will be disproportionately affected by it, and also that there have to be certain kinds of reparative measures that must come out of it. So, in my perhaps generous understanding of the hate crime framework, hate crime language can introduce this repertoire of understanding. Now, hopefully, because obviously these kind of criminalizing the victim is so deeply embedded in how our police and criminal justice system operates, one concept is not going to remove it. But the hope is that that brings a certain repertoire of understanding and institutional forms that can start sort of chipping the worst forms, at least chipping them away. Now, why is hate, quote unquote, or hate motivated hostility towards identity worse or different kinds of crimes? That is a genuinely interesting and difficult question. So the defense which is given is that there are social ramifications. Right? So hate crimes are meant to be message crimes. Quite often they are not meant only for the victim. So victim is not the only stakeholder here. It is meant for the victim community, because community is the background in which this is happening. Because it also is not merely an individual incident, but emerging out of social dominance and subordination, it is a larger social problem more than just an individual criminal act. And therefore, it has to be taken more seriously, or at least differently seriously than individual crimes. Now, in the US, for instance, that throws up really complicated constitutional questions. Because there the conflict is between freedom of thought and hate crime. Because what many people argue is hate crimes are thought crimes. You're being given additional punishment for having a certain thought of a certain motivation. I'm not going to close this and say this is not a meaningful objection. What I'm saying is this is actually true. It is true. What people are being, in criminal law, people are prosecuted for acts and the intent to have caused it, but not their motivations necessarily. What happens when you bring in those motivations, the thoughts, or the identity of the victim, as Atrocities Act does, right? It complicates our understanding of criminal law. But the justification given, which I think is by and large for me satisfactory, is because of the scale and the ramifications of these kind of crimes. The role of political ideology and particularly Hindutva here is significant. I don't think the hate crime concept or framing can resolve a political problem. For me, the question is, does it open up conceptually a space to accommodate the problem of politics? And I think to some extent it does. Because if subordination is at stake in these kind of crimes, then subordination would happen because of larger historical trajectories, because of political ideology, because of a whole range of reasons that we see with caste or religion or gender and other things. And finally, about sort of this interesting point about, does hate crime framing provide an opportunity to solve, hate to say it, but let me just say it, the collective action problem or something, right? So the argument I'm making in the paper is, it's speculative. And it is sort of emerging from the question of why is it that that we've not been able to address even atrocities, forget about other kinds of hate crimes, against groups in a consolidated way. Why doesn't, until very recently for instance, hate crime sort of advocacy exist? Even when it exists, why doesn't it often get the support of communities across the board? It's being done by liberal, whatever, people like us, right? So they are people who are professionally oriented, lawyers, journalists, etc. But what about the community organizations, unless they're affected by it? Right? So Muslims would go with lynching, etc. But there seems to be a problem here of broader solidarity and collaboration. I was speculating that maybe one reason is because the institutional pathways with the state are variegated. So Dalits or scheduled castes or scheduled tribes would have their own pathways, their own political representatives, their own institutions, their own laws. Women have their own laws, their own, well, representatives, a bit complicated, but their own political parties and their own communications and their own commissions. There was minority commission. One minority commission is dead right now, right? Because they don't believe minorities exist in India. And minorities in India apparently only mean Muslims and Christians, but in any case. But fine, there's a minority commission. So if I'm a Muslim and there's a hate crime against me, the minority commission is where I go. Perhaps NHRC was meant to sort of solve some of these sort of coordination issues. And maybe NHRC is a very good reason why I think maybe my argument is a bit too optimistic. But what I wanted to propose was maybe a shared framework would create some platform where people could battle and struggle together. it's completely speculative. And maybe it's not going to work, but we haven't tried it, so I have no idea.
Thank you for those comments, and I'll just open it up for discussions. In the interest of time, if everybody can just be brief with their comment or with their question, people can raise hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Such a
Yeah. Okay, so we talked about the two different things, the exposure, politics of exposure and politics of composing. So in composing, you mentioned David also. I'd like to add two more things which people may have already checked out, but I think they're really worth checking out. One is H-pop by Kunal Purohit, where he actually gets into the kind of songs which are created and which get very popular and are played in these festive occasions all across the north, and which are inciting people to take violent action. Right? Hindutva pop, H-pop by Kunal Purohit, that's one very good one. And another article which is written when I think Muhammad Ali for the Wired, where he gets into a vigilante group, cow vigilante group. He actually goes there regularly, meets them, and he describes how the whole build up to the violence happens. So those are very
a caravan
interesting
piece
studies.
somewhere.
Huh?
I think it might have been a caravan piece, but yeah,
No,
great.
it wasn't Wired. It was an international piece.
Ah, right, of course.
Right. So these are two important things. Now, one thing which I wanted to talk about was the language. We keep talking about the language. I feel one of the reasons why we've landed here is because as a society we haven't shown any resistance to the emerging language of the hate. Right? For instance, when I was a child, I know that saying Hindu Rashtra out aloud was not, it wasn't a good thing. I mean, if you began to speak about Hindu Rashtra, you could be frowned upon. You would look at you strangely because it wasn't something which was said out aloud or discussed. But today, Hindu Rashtra is on everybody's lips. Everybody is accepting that we talk about Hindu Rashtra. How do we talk about Hindu Rashtra today with so much ease? Obviously, because the term itself has been gaining currency. And the same way, things like love jihad. Why is love jihad become even a concept, right? So we need to show, like just as Manavi was pointing out, that how do we deal with all this? We need to deal with things which are happening right next to us. We need to deal with it firstly by showing resistance to the language itself, right? Not accepting things like love jihad now, for instance. That's one of the things. The third last thing that I wanted to say in my observation was that I have very closely worked alongside pilgrims and devotees. Right? I wrote a book called Bol Bam, Approaches to Shiva, in which I traveled with the Kavariyas. Right? And I have done this at many different locations across India, but mainly at Haridwar, which is right now the hub of the whole thing, Deoghar. And what happened was, my book was written, during the Kavar season of 2012 is when I did my maximum work. And before that, in all the other shrines I visited. And till that time, till 2012, it wasn't such a communal gathering. That's because what happened was that Shiva devotees are totally different from the ones which used to go as car sevaks, These are literally the disaffected youth and the migrant workers which go across the country walking at the time of the lockdown. That's the composition of that Kavar Yatra actually. So what happens is, during the Kavar Yatra, they drop all their differences, including caste. They call each other as Bam, and they say Bol Bam, and they go. And it's like a very leveling yatra. Now, if you look at the yatra today and the number of complaints that have come, you can see that this is now no longer a thing of individual incidents of people having a fight over some food items being too expensive, which is what the policeman in my book points out. He says, "अरे ये छोटे-छोटे तो होते रहते हैं, मगर वो पहले जैसा नहीं है." He makes a distinction between the sloganeering car sevaks and the Kavariyas, whom he considers as okay, right? But today, these have become like state-sponsored hooligans, and the difference is exactly that. As you said, that what happens is it happens in a mundane level. So the police and the way the police have begun to operate at the ground level has changed substantially, to an extent that now it is, if you just wear a saffron scarf and do anything at all, you will be okay for that moment. And so for these youth who are coming out of the confines of their horrible lives and they're getting to spend just 1 month out on the road like this. Okay, it's heady. It's like, chalo, utha ke kisi ko bhi maar do. You know, that kind of thing. It's the state sponsored because the state is really a mute spectator here. And as Manami pointed out, in the 3.0 of this new government, in such a short span, the reason why there has been 24 to 26 of these incidents, it's because of the fact that they have understood that nothing else is working. Their appeal has gone flat totally. And people are restless about other issues, so they're just going back to core competence, which is what faith manufactured for them. So I agree that ground level pay, you know what happens as in UP, I've lived in UP, as soon as the government changes, the daroga ka might changes, you know, ab Thakur ka Raj hoga. You know, in Mayawati's time it was different. As soon as this Yogi came in, ab Thakur ki chali. That kind of talk becomes tendency because everybody understands that the power equation is shifting. So those were just my 3 things. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. But anyway, please check out those books also.
Is everybody okay with the question answer session being recorded? Yeah? Okay, now if people please keep questions brief, yeah.
Or comments.
Comments, yeah. 1, 2, and 3. Thank you. Question, yeah. 1, 2, 3, yeah. June, you can go first and the person in front of you after that.
I have a question. This is regarding the shooting that happened in the train at Palmer last year, where the Jawan murdered 4 people, including his own officer was. So I have 2 questions. One is, he's arrested and he's being processed and all that, but he didn't say anything like Jai Shri Ram, which is very, okay, it's a God's name. He took names of 2 people. He took Modi's name, he took Yogi's name. What can legal, experts do, given that one information that the person who is doing the murders is taking your name and doing the murder? Is there any legal way to, make it bigger than just a small shootout in a train? That's one question. On the same thing, the other question is, how do you think the media was managed so well on this case? Because it's, in my opinion, it should become really scary because we all take trains all the time. So how did the story become so small and how did it get lost so badly?
Person in front of you?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Sure.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I attended this talk is because I survived an instance of riots myself, 2020 February Delhi riots, where I was there as a volunteer. And since we were talking about the language of hate, I want to speak something about the language of hate used by, by the perpetrators themselves, based upon what I saw myself. Many of the reasons I survived is because I was not a resident of that place and I come from a Hindu upper caste location, so I was able to escape. But that instance taught me more about my Hinduism than I guess any academia could ever. And as someone who has worked in early childhood development, I have seen, I've encountered a lot of kids from especially Hindu upper caste backgrounds being taught various kinds of chants and prayers from a young age. And as we all know, unlike a lot of religions like Islam and Christianity, which have a deep-rooted faith coming from, say, the Bible or the Quran, Hinduism is a religion that is formed out of opposition. It's formed out of insecurity. At least that is what I believe. And that's why when I noticed what I noticed, and during 2020 February, I think a lot of people will already know, one of the major chants that was being used over and over again was Desh ke gaddaron ko goli maro salo ko. And what I felt, what I realized at least, and this is not backed by any academic research, but my own experience growing up as an upper caste Hindu and seeing what it is capable of, is that these chants, the kind of language that the mobs bring about, that itself brings about a sense of community that Hinduism, at least upper caste Hinduism coming from the Brahminical lens, often lacks. And in that way, I feel like a lot of times this language of hate and this emotion of hate isn't just a pure something that is directed towards a victim or a minority, but it is also stemming from a lack of community and intra-hatred that exists within Hinduism. And I feel that in a situation like that, the situation that I myself experienced, these kinds of chants, I mean, even protesters, of course, use chants to rile each other up, to gather up courage. But on the opposite side, especially when it's Hindu mobs doing it, brings about a kind of community, a kind of moldability almost, because once again, Hinduism does not have any core texts. It is, I mean, as kids grow up, they learn of the chants, and those meaning of those chants themselves can be molded up. And I think with the coming of the Hindutva Rashtra, that is something that is happening. The meaning of those chants is, the meaning is being ascribed later, and the chants come first. And as it happens, the Hindu Rashtra, the kind of language and the kind of emotions it is bringing up, is filling in almost some kind of lack that Hinduism, especially upper caste Hinduism, always had. And I feel that this hatred, this language of hatred that the perpetrators themselves use, is quite integral to that. So that were my 2 cents.
Thanks.
Could you translate the chant to English?
Usually the traitors of the nation.
Shoot the traitors of the nation.
Yeah.
Mridula and then yeah.
So I have a comment and a question. So one thing I've noticed in the hate crime discourse is that we tend to neglect the role and effect of the bystanders, role of the bystanders and the effect of such crimes on bystanders. Of course, in my observation and understanding, these crimes usually happen in public eye, right? So what can the bystanders do, and why do we tend to not speak about them? And bystanders, I don't mean people who are liberals who come from afar and they're responding to it from afar, but people who are immediately in a surrounding. So what can they do? How do we place them into this context of hate crime?
So mine comes from a specific case. I reported in Roorkee, and there was a case, quite a famous one I think, where a local church was attacked by the neighborhood. So it was a family-run church, and the people they've known for many years attacked the church. Then there was a counter FIR that you were converting people or something like that. And then in the end it became like the investigation is on, and then it just continues, and they were under threat. It just brought up a lot of questions about what you were saying, group against group. But when it's people you've known for many years, there might not be any love there or anything, but your neighbor, how does the law, or how would it just brings up something very existential about it. Has something changed in the past few years, or like, because it was just very strange for me to see that, people you've known for many years, people you may have grown up with, gone to school with, now suddenly come and attack and fully break down the church, and it becomes something that is like a he said, she said, as if it didn't happen. There was so much evidence that we recorded, like the church was completely broken down, but it becomes something that is just a matter of investigation. So,
Just one second, let him respond.
Thanks for those recommendations. That's great. And Kunal Rohit was actually quite deeply involved with the documentation we did on hate crime watch as well. So definitely recommend it. And hopefully we'll get him to come back and work more on hate crime soon. So I don't know enough about the train shooting case, so I will not comment on it. So obviously in my head, on a completely facile note, I was like, this is clearly invocation of God, because people are not biological in any case. So, but I have no idea what other things happened and what was the media covered. So maybe others in the room would have to say. Role of Mridula?
Yes.
Yeah. Role of the bystander. That's a really important and really interesting point, because I guess the most striking thing, particularly about these incidents that get to be known as lynching incidents, is that a lot of violence happens for the public. The violence is meant to constitute a certain public. It imagines a public. It is meant to create a certain affect in public. And it is spectacle, right? So the violence as spectacle is crucial. Which may be a bit different from many other incidents of hate crime, contemporary hate crime that happen, which are not meant to happen as openly. is that. So I think the kind of hate crimes we often see in the case of India, particularly anti-Muslim violence, and definitely caste violence, is much similar to the lynching kind of cases that we know from South, the US, slavery, Jim Crow, etc. So those sort of public spectacles. And there's a lot of really disconcerting but really important work on how these incidents are photographed, how people are hung on trees, in order to sort of create that sort of atmosphere. Which connects with your comment as well, right? Because the spectacle of violence is meant to then generate a certain kind of solidarity among the perpetrators. And also among the public who are meant to then participate in that. And one of the most disconcerting things that we saw in the cow-related violence cases in Haryana, for instance, and Rajasthan as well, is how these incidents were telecast on Facebook Live, for instance, or they were recorded and then put on. Part of that is obviously story of impunity that they did feel because of political support, but part of it was also to create an audience for these people, because what they have realized is that this is not just sort of a political Hindutva act of creating an audience and creating a Hindutva public, but it is also quite opportunistically the best way for them to climb the political ladder, because they will, even if they end up going to jail, they will have a shot at being a local BJP worker and then maybe becoming a more active politician. We see that across the board in Haryana, at least until 2 years ago when I was doing it, and I don't see a reason why that would have changed at all. Because many of those people who engage in acts of violence have done quite well. So it is both an opportunistic thing to create a spectacle, but it is also to create a certain public sphere, to misuse that phrase, and to create that spectacle of violence that creates that sort of affect. And the complete flip side of that is the neighbor question. I don't know how I can necessarily answer that, but I have two reflections on the question. So whenever we went into the field, and the vast amount of documentation work or documentaries, for instance, that are made on people who suffer not any kind of hate crime, including sectarian violence, right, mass violence or communal riots, is what I've constantly noticed is what I call sort of the narrative of strangeness. And what I mean by that is when victims are spoken to, even in Delhi so-called riots, right? When victims were interviewed, when they were asked, invariably there are certain kinds of formats in which a victim communicates. It takes a long time to break those when people start both feeling open and comfortable, but also when they themselves break the frameworks that they are working within. So one of the most interesting ones, the tragic ones, is when they say that, oh, our neighbors didn't do anything. They were all people from outside. That life was great, we were all brothers and sisters, and then something like this happened. Which can be quite frustrating for a scholar trying to sort of really show how this is part and parcel or emanates out of these social embedded forms of violence. Because the victims themselves tell us, no, they are not our neighbors. Well, we know they are. And that it happened suddenly. The violence was a strange thing that happened. But our brothers and sisters would never do it. We know that that doesn't work like that, and we have evidence to show that. And my feeling is that victims, by and large, are very reluctant to both acknowledge it, but also feel comfortable in sharing it, partly because they live next to it. And then the second element of that is desire to go back to the normal, even if the normal is constructed normal. The normal is, so in Muzaffarnagar riots, so-called riots that sort of we studied, people want to go back and live their normal lives because their properties are there and their families are there and their lives are there, and the alternatives they have, which is living in a camp, which is now sort of become practically a ghetto, are just terrible. That's not a viable choice. So these sort of contexts, I think, constitute a certain picture of the normal and a certain picture of violence being strange. And for us, just to go back to the exposure composition thing, a lot of the exposure mode is intervention mode. Right? Violence has happened, we go in, we document, we get a report, we file a PIL, and we say, okay, we've done what we could. Composing takes time. You have to go, spend time, as in Kunal had to spend almost, I think it took almost 10 years in small bits and pieces, but he had to spend time with some really unsavory character, right, who he completely disliked. But obviously he had to develop a sense of empathy towards them.
But
Same with,
humanized.
absolutely. They have to be humanized. Otherwise we'll never understand violence. And also, perpetrators of violence are also victims of violence in some sense, or a
And the
different kind of violence.
normalizing of violence and how we have to live with the same neighbors again is very well described in the book City on Fire. They are Masroor Khan's. Yeah, please take it. It's a lovely book. Really, very important.
So, and I think that is an illustration of the communal riot sort of thing, because he describes that, right?
Yeah.
So it's about, particularly it happens in communal riots, and maybe the notion of the riot, the language of the riot, seems to suggest this disruption of the norm. It's a law and order problem. Nobody can be fundamentally blamed for that. Ages ago, Ashish Nandi, while talking about the partition of India, said that that's how victims of partition also thought about it. They said this was a zone of madness. Their neighbors did that. As in the Hindus or Sikhs who left, who fled from Pakistan, many of their, obviously there were neighbors who saved them, tried to save them, but there were many neighbors who committed those crimes. And many of them tried to frame that as a moment of madness when nobody was fundamentally blameworthy, and that's a really complicated emotion. But at the same time, it is, I think, a duty of scholars, but journalists, I'm assuming you're a journalist, and others, to sort of stay there, to inhabit that space, and to just take time to understand the different layers of it in order to ultimately compose that context.
I quit journalism. Now doing law.
We should have a long conversation about that.
Yeah. I'll just quickly respond to the question that June had asked about the RPF killing. I'm just going to reiterate the statement that was made before he shot those people down. He said, पाकिस्तान से ऑपरेट हुए हैं, तुम्हारी मीडिया यही मीडिया कवरेज दिखा रही है, पता चल रहा है उनको, सब पता चल रहा है, इनके आका वहाँ है. Which essentially translates that you all are operating from Pakistan, your masters are living from there, you're being operated from there. अगर वोट देना है, अगर हिंदुस्तान में रहना है, तो मैं कहता हूँ मोदी और योगी ये दो हैं और आपके ठाकरे. Which essentially translates to, if you want to vote, if you want to live in India, then I say Modi and Yogi. These are the two, and your Thackeray to vote for.
Which
Thackeray?
You'll be quite disappointed.
Because this is also the train to en route there. So, I mean, just to respond to your, is June even there?
She just.
Oh wow. But anyway, for those of you who are still interested in the question, it's essentially to say that it's the responsibility of the lawyer to be able to make that connection to from the statement to the crime it constitutes. That's in any given case, and so it's the question of these two people. It doesn't stop there, because it's also saying that the question of voting is a question of electorally voting in a particular way, which is related to your citizenship rights of voting. So it's really the responsibility of the lawyers in that case to be able to make that connection for the court in a compelling manner.
And
to be able to
in
illustrate.
the 2024 election and aftermath, it's been again underlined, because now you have actual MLAs and MPs
Right.
saying that
Right.
we will work for you if you have voted for us. We know you have not voted for us, so we will not vote for you. It's like literally they're taking that RPF guys thing and magnifying it.
People can raise hands. 1, 2. Yeah. So
I have two questions.
3.
Yeah, the first one being the nature of a secular nation, and how like there are countries that are not, that have a state religion. There are supposedly secular nation, and the US while on paper secular, had a lot of anti-religious policies. So my question being,
Who had anti-religious policies?
USSR. So my question is, how does that affect hate crime and things like this? My second question being, so we know that when hate crimes happen, there is a lot of proof goes away. Media, the cameras, NAS body cameras, all of that. There is no evidence. So my question is that, given that, for example, for rape, there is a different burden of proof when compared to other crimes. The victims, the victims'
Responsibility.
the statement is considered to be the burden of proof to the defendant, accused. So, like, is there possibility of there being a law where there is a different level of proof or things like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask that as far as extensively documented a lot of data about hate crimes, there have been instances of hate crimes initiated by the police itself, like how they have denied reporting like cases or registering FIRs. So at this point, when we know that the violence in the country is rising and the police is doing nothing almost about it, then how do we keep the power of the repressive state apparatuses in check? Like, how do we as citizens respond to that?
Saurav and then yeah.
Mohsin and Mani, could you people conceptualize from your experience how the truth and reconciliation actually work? So, and would truth and reconciliation be a good mechanism to address hate crimes in terms of composing?
So I might be a little uninformed about this since I started like taking interest in this issue like 5 years ago. Mostly after the CA NRC protests that happened in West Bengal. I'm from West Bengal. Why is it that hate crimes happening within like religious communities, like Hindu on Hindu hate crimes or Muslim on Muslim hate crimes, are not being as sensationalized as a Hindu on Muslim hate crimes? And my second question would be, why are again an uninformed opinion maybe, why is it that we don't have much discourse now as to what religious hate crimes used to be, or what is the historical discourse of religious hate crimes in India that used to happen before 2014?
Why don't we? Is that your
Yeah,
question?
yeah.
Great questions. Secular nation. Oh gosh. I have no idea. And the reason I have no idea is I don't know what secular means and secularism means, or at least sort of it's not an obvious question, and I don't know whether how secular we were, and it's a goalpost that keeps shifting. And if by secularism you mean a country that is not sectarian, does not make sectarian or religiously discriminatory laws, definitely the Indian Constitution demands that. If that is what secularism means, then I suppose hate crime is an even more severe problem than it is not. And that sort of just raises the constitutional stakes. As the word secularism was used in the Supreme Court judgment of Tehsing Poonawalla, for instance, I'm just going to be like a bit annoying and say that I just dislike the sprinkling of this word here and there in order to then sort of push for legitimize a certain view without having a keener, closer eye for a judgment to use as much secularism as it wants, but then lay down guidelines on lynching without defining lynching for me is not helpful. So I'm okay with no secularism or no secularism talk with getting stuff done. But also secularism is quite fraught, so it'll just open up a longer conversation. But we can have that, we can have it. But the burden of proof question is, I think, spot on. I think hate crime policies and laws can definitely do. Atrocities Act does that, for instance. If Atrocities Act broadly is understood as a hate crime policy, or at least sort of has a family resemblance to it. I think misogynistic violence and sexual crimes are forms of hate crime. They have a family relationship, they're in the same galaxy. So absolutely that is something that can happen. But what that requires is, at least from a legal point of view, a very clear definition of what is the crime, right? And what is the process. We have all the legal tools. The questions are whether that will happen and there's a proper democratic process to make it happen. But also how sort of the nitty-gritties and the machinery of the police is going to implement. So there's a universe outside sort of legal text that is the struggle here. How to check police hate crime. So the first thing is that police. So I don't know whether I'm sure this group doesn't, but there are lots of people who feel that hate crime misses out state violence, but it doesn't. State officials can commit and do commit hate crime. So the role of the police, for instance, is both to cover up hate crime, but also to actively commit it. Not just criminalize the victim, but actually to go out of its way to commit it. I think there's something even more disconcerting that is happening, because when I was doing field work in Haryana and UP around 2019, I felt that I wasn't even able, or Haryana, I wasn't even able to identify who's a police officer in the police station and who's not. The only difference could be maybe if I pay attention to their uniform. Because Haryana started distributing, I think in 2015 or 2016, these ID cards to Gorakshaks, where Gorakshaks became this extended limb of the police. But I think by the time I was done with my field work, something reverse had happened. The police had become the extended limb of the Gorakshaks. And the police would ordinarily accompany the Gaurakshaks, and the Gaurakshaks would go and beat up people. And the role of the police is basically a bureaucrat that is mediating this a bit, or sort of providing a cover, or even participating in it. So and now we have a language for it. So for example, Christoph Jeffrelo, and I sort of use that language in my work. He uses the word deinstitutionalization. He doesn't necessarily use it, if I remember correctly, in the context of police per se. He uses it in a broader way. But I think definitely a lot of police in India, particularly in these kind of heightened, hyper-politicized contexts, have become depoliticized. Because you can't identify an institution working in a bounded way. Because a lot of imagination of liberal legality relies on this mythology, which has to be constructed on the ground of the difference between the state and society. Market, state, and society operating as three sort of limbs. In reality, that doesn't happen. But law operates only when it is able to police those boundaries and then hold each of them accountable to a certain set of certain norms. Now we can critique that, but for that system to work, at least that should operate in some real sense, right? Achieve some sort of life on the ground. But the Hindutva project, I think, the Hindu Rashtra, for instance, I think is, in its practice, is fundamentally oriented towards deinstitutionalization, where the line between state and society, we can critique that line as the critical liberal, sort of whatever, anti-liberal critical, but they have already done that. They have broken the link, the line separating the state from society. And here society is a very specific kind of public, the Hindutva public that operates. And your point about then in that context, how to hold the state accountable is absolutely spot on. I have no idea. Because the language of exposure, going back again to it, but anyway, our language of law, for instance, is meant to hold the state accountable when the state agrees with the principles you are asserting. Right? So it works because the constitution, secularism, etc., the state believes in it, right? So when we say this is wrong and this violates the law, this is your law, and therefore we hold you accountable, it operates in a universe where there is at least some truth to the matter, that norms are shared between the state and other stakeholders. What happens when that doesn't work anymore? When they say we don't believe in the constitution, or that we don't believe India is secular, or we don't believe that these people are citizens anymore. And I think that is where we are already. Right? And I think the reason I don't do a lot of law work anymore is because I have no idea, because the role of law was to hold the state accountable, assuming that it has certain traction. What happens when law loses that traction? We can keep talking about law and secularism, etc., but that's poetry, right? From a lawyer's, and that's great. We should have poetry. See, anti-CA protest is beautiful, and poetry and constitution as poetry is beautiful and lovely, but it didn't have the bite, the institutional bite, that makes law a tool to do exposing accountability kind of work. It still has bite of solidarity with it, but seems to have sort of lost that traction, and that is a moment of crisis, I think, and that's something to sort of worry about. Intra-group. So I don't know which intra-group instances you're thinking about. So for instance, caste is an so-called perhaps intra-Hindu, if you believe that kind of violence. So there is atrocities act. Perhaps, as it's an empirical question, whether crimes committed by one group of Muslims against another group of Muslims does not, even in that local context, gain visibility. Maybe not. Maybe you have some instances in mind. But I suppose that may have a lot to do with politics, that may have a lot to do with what media covers it, that may have a lot to do with dominant groups. So I don't, for me, the question of hate crime or this kind of violence is not Hindu, Muslim, etc., these bounded communities. In fact, the bounded communities are created or constituted through these acts of violence, and they can exist among groups. In Pakistan, for instance, Ahmadiyas are targeted or Shias are targeted. Over here, I don't know if there are sort of any serious cases, but caste violence is writ large among Muslims, even among Christians, for instance.
In fact, Shia Sunni violence has come down a lot because of this.
Exactly. Those Shia Sunni, old Lucknow riots, etc., don't tend to happen. But caste violence is still very much there. Honor killings are still very much there. Over obviously misogynistic on the system. So yeah, but then we can have a longer conversation on that. I hadn't considered truth and reconciliation very much. It sounds nice. I was struggling. That's why I'm taking your question at the end. I'm struggling to sort of picture how it will be operationalized. It seems to me that truth and reconciliation as an institutional form can exist only when, and that has its limitations, right? When there is a regime change and there's a broader sort of political transformation. And in that transformation of the state and transformation of politics, then there's a social question of truth and reconciliation, both as a way of rehabilitating, as a way of truth telling, as a way of peace building, right? So there are a whole range of things. But I don't know of any truth and reconciliation context in which there's an antagonistic state, or that moment of transformation has not happened. I'm not a scholar of truth and reconciliation, so there could be those cases, and if there are, they would definitely be interesting
I know
resources.
only one. So I think Rwanda, I think
That was after.
the institutionalization happened in South Africa, but in Rwanda also after the genocide happened. Where
It's a state
But
transformed.
that's
Yeah,
what-
was
after. It's post.
But the state was antagonistic against the other community.
But there's the whole world looking at it, right? So I think there are those political sort of transformative sort of things should be there. But the language of truth and reconciliation is
No, but I think that one paradigm shift did occur on the 1st of July when on the floor of Parliament, Rahul Gandhi said out loud those three important sentences that Narendra Modi पूरा हिंदू समाज नहीं है, भाजपा पूरा हिंदू समाज नहीं है, और RSS पूरा हिंदू समाज नहीं है.
तो हम इंतजार करते हैं कि हिंदू समाज कब खड़ा होगा.
No,
तो then
but
there
the
will be
thing
truth
is,
and
that was
reconciliation.
something which should have been said all these years by so many pravachan kartas and so many, and nobody said it, and the Hindu establishment was actually not even protesting all the things that were being done in their name. But those three sentences being said so loudly, even though they were later expunged, have actually penetrated very deep, and the youth have received it very well. And now, if you see, even the language of the Hindu establishment, like the Shankaracharya Abhimukteshwara, has become very combative. He's also begun to challenge the government.
Sure. So that a bunch of sort of things about that statement, but anyway, Shankaracharyas, etc., what their agenda, etc., is. But it's complicated. As in the Hindu, because it moves away from the hate crime conversation. But I think the question of Hindu Samaj is fundamental because that sort of connects with your comment earlier and this, which is that what is Hindu Samaj? And Hindu Samaj does not have that organized character that it can be mobilized. And I usually get quite nervous when somebody says Hindu Samaj one way or the other, even when they are saying Modi is not Hindu Samaj, because that sort of, I remember Ambedkar. So
But I
things.
feel it is important to resist the appropriation of Hindu Samaj.
Let me just respond because I said this is a politically really important and pregnant point. The question is, what is the language and what are the strategies to use to oppose them? Do we reify Hindu Samaj in order to do it? What are the boundaries and does that create other kinds of challenges? Or do we just refuse to accept these parameters altogether? I don't have an answer. And I'm happy to sort of strategically even accept, well done, Rahul Gandhi, you did. And if it works, it's fine. But I'm quite nervous about that particular process. When somebody says that Hindu Samaj will bring peace, because then Hindu Samaj has to be constituted. And the terms of that constitution are complicated. But anyway, I'm keeping it open. But let's just come back to the truth and reconciliation thing. And again, another sort of pessimistic, I was working with sort of this Karwan-e-Mohabbat exercise. How did that sort of work out? Karwan-e-Mohabbat was meant to respond to lynching cases and hate crime. And by the way, I'm a supporter of it, and I participated in it, and I adore the people who are leading it. But something as people who are part of that to auto-critique here, which is that the language which was quite used early on, and we were quite invested in that, was the language of truth and reconciliation. And it was also about justice and reparation, etc. Right? But there was also this element of bringing justice through reconciliation, and otherwise it will never work. Right? Almost all the trips that were made by Harsh and his team were to Muslim victims, and it became a Karwan-e-Mohabbat where a few already converted people, leaders of our civil society, are going and telling Muslim victims what happened to you was really bad, we are with you, we'll give you legal support. There's a reconciliation. The Gandhian act would be, follow up on the Ambedkar thing, is to do the opposite. To actually go to the perpetrator's house and sit there and say that you need to have penance. We may have a problem with language of penance and we may have a problem with Gandhian paradigm, but that is a different language of courage. where the reason I was struggling with it is I felt one, without that it is impossible. Whatever the Hindu Samaj is, without engaging with that, it's not going to work. Who will engage with it? I can't think of a single institution, a body, a person with a moral courage and integrity, in my view at least, Gandhi, doing that. And it's one thing or the other. It's fine to sort of for Rahul Gandhi to say, or anybody else for that matter, to talk about Hindu Samaj responding and Shankaracharya saying, I saw the video clip, I have no
think
problem.
That was definitely one of the reasons why he even brought that Shiva photo into the parliament, and he's doing it deliberately.
Can I
because
please urge you to have a conversation later?
Yeah, but we need to have a
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah.
And then I don't mind Rahul
No,
Gandhi.
because
it's
I
fine.
feel
Yeah,
that
I
feel
don't
that-
come across, I'm being
No,
recorded,
it's
it's
not,
fine.
it's not the thing that I'm kind of putting him up as a poster boy or something, but I feel at some point in this whole thing of how the language has been crafted and the appropriation of all the symbols, there has to be some attempt to reclaim. Otherwise,
Absolutely. And that's why Kavadiya is such an important thing as well. The image of Shiv, which also connects with Rahul Gandhi, is so important. As in, I'm from Kashmir, so I'm like, I have an automatic bent towards Shaivism. I'm like, yeah, Shaivism will save us. No?
Okay. I think we're going to just try and close the question answer session now. I know one person had a question. Maybe you can just speak to him after, if that's all right. And I want to just request Tanveer, and I'll just introduce him briefly also. Tanveer is a activist known to most Bangalore circles, and he's present in solidarity in all kinds of gatherings. He's also was a part of Mohsin mission, which did some phenomenal work during COVID in terms of providing support and relief to those who were facing any kind of dearth of beds, oxygen. He's also one of the few people who actually was there in terms of acting on what is called dignity to the dead, because at that point of time there weren't a lot of people who were sort of there to do the burials and the cremations and so on. And the reason I'm asking him to come in is that he also does a lot of work with our campaign called Campaign Against Hate Speech Data. And in that work, he's one of those voices who has come out very strongly, and he's had this eternal hope that he's carried with him in his work and in your presence. And I think in a conversation as overwhelming as this one, where we are all sitting with not just what's going on in the head, but what's going on in the heart of what this hatred is doing to us. I really think hearing from someone like him in terms of just his thoughts and reflections on why he does this, why we think this kind of work is important, and what sort of keeps him going and what he thinks fuels these kind of collective actions. So, Tanveer, English, Hindi, kuch bhi chahiye.
Not keeping too well, down with the cold. It's just that the kind of values that have come across in my, whether it's my family or the schooling, which has taught us all of this. So back then, we didn't have all this nonsense of USA in a big form post 2013. Okay. I didn't know what caste was. I didn't know if John was an Orthodox Malayali Christian back then. He was just my friend. So this is how we grew up. Bangalore was totally different. And having seen a lot of it, coming from a community which is born the brunt, we've seen how it is and how but at the same time, it gives us a lot of opportunities. And I'm very hopeful, very hopeful. And whatever we do, whatever results it brings, positive or negative, or whatever, immaterial of it, I feel that at that time it has to be done, and we're happy that a lot of things have happened. Be it with hate speech better, and even in COVID, we met so many souls from different communities, and we didn't know that it happened. If I would call it, it was an opportunity in adversity. So we met so many different souls. So seeing all of it, I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful that things can change. It doesn't need big numbers. It's just a few of us who can change. And times will change. Immaterial of what goes. There is an end. The best of lives also has to end. If what we perceive as a bad life or what, that also will end. So with that feeling that this is not eternal, there is an end. I'm very hopeful that in this span of things, what we do is important.
Thank you, Tanvi. Thank you so much, Mohsin, for a very insightful talk. It's given us all a lot to think about, and I just want to reiterate on Tanvi's note that it's not a hopeless situation. It's not just mere words. It's something that we all do in our practice. I know this for all of us who do this, whether it's just simply with our friend circles, it's the work that we do with our families, and it's really going to take more of us and more work like this, more thinking like this, and more dreaming of transformation where we don't have to ever deal and grapple with the concept of hate ever again, right? It's how do we completely remove that from a caste stratified society which has lived like this for so long. And on that note, we draw this to a close. Thank you so much for coming. We all housekeeping things. We all wash our own cups ourselves. The kitchen is on the left there. And if you all have not written your name down on the list that was circulated, that's our ALF mailing list. So please get in touch with me, and I will pass on the list for you. Thank
And
you.
there's a small donation box there.
Yes, please. Give us reason to make it bigger.